Burned a little, not gonna lie. Whew. How's it going, guys? So, as you saw in the last video, we assessed the subframe damage where it snapped the diff mount on the front. And where I left off the video, we were going to decide what we were going to do about the situation. So initially, I got my good buddy Matt to go through his shop and see if he could find a used subframe kicking around that maybe we could just swap the subframe into the car. And we checked that out. Dodge doesn't make them anymore, so we had to check out and try to find some used ones. Now we found a couple of used ones. One was for around 900 or 1,000 Canadian dollars or so, maybe a little less, I can't remember. It was somewhere around there, 900 I think is what it was. And we found some used ones in the States that were a little cheaper, but of course then we'd have to ship it up, so you'd be looking at about the same price anyway. So we did think about that route. The one thing that kind of deterred me from that is I did put this out to a couple forums and a couple 5-7 Hemi groups and stuff like that, and just asked if anybody's ever seen anything like that before, because I certainly hadn't heard of anybody snapping the subframe where their front end of their diff mounts to the cradle. One person did message back and say his car was completely stock and he also snapped that front mount and he had to pull it out. He re-welded it and then put it back in, hasn't had any problems since. So that kind of got me thinking, that's kind of crazy that a stock 5.7 Challenger would snap that mount. That just seems just insane to me. That doesn't seem right. And another thing I noticed was in the comments of the last video when we showed us taking the subframe out, getting the diff off of there and kind of assessing the damage, one of you guys did comment and say that you also had the same problem with that front mount shearing off where the diff mounts at the front. So that's two people now that I've talked to that have had that same problem. So immediately that kind of deterred me from going out and buying a used subframe that was in good shape and then swapping that out and putting it in the car. Simply because if I went to all that trouble to swap out all the suspension parts and everything, axles and everything, into a new subframe, put it in, and then I snapped it after the next race season, I would be so mad. So the next step for me, I kind of decided in my head that I really did want to try to weld and repair this one. And the next step was going to be to see if either A, I needed to hire a welder that had maybe a stick welder that was a little bit beefier to handle the thicker metal of the subframe, or B, to see if my little MIG welder that I use for most of my projects around the house could handle 1/8 steel well. Now my welder is rated for 1/8 as the top end of what it can do. It is the maximum that it's rated to do. And that made me a little bit nervous because sometimes welders will say they can do something at the top end, but they can barely do it, and just under the right circumstances, and it's not that much penetration, and it maybe for like a gentle repair, but not something that's going to see a lot of stress. So that had me worried. So the first thing I wanted to do was actually do a test and see how much penetration and how well my little MIG welder could repair or weld up 1/8 mild steel. So I ran down to my local Princess Auto and grabbed myself a piece of 1/8 flat stock. It was just a 1-inch strip of 1/8 thick flat stock material, and just cut it up into some strips just to do some test welds and see how well my welder could handle it. So after that test weld, it turned out that my welder actually did a really, really good job of welding up 1/8 mild steel. So after that, I was kind of in business. So first things first, we got to remove all the paint off any surface that we're going to be welding. You obviously can't weld over any painted surfaces. That contaminates the crap out of the weld. It's just, you just don't do it. So first things first, We're going to remove the paint off all the mounting surfaces where we're going to be welding, and hopefully really stiffen and strengthen this mounting point of where the diff mounts to on the cradle. So obviously I've got a few different tools that I'm going to use to remove the paint in the areas that I am going to be welding, including wire wheels. I've also got a 80 grit flap wheel, and then just good old-fashioned sandpaper for anywhere else that I need to get to that might be a little bit difficult to get with either of these. But either way, they should do the trick to get most of the material off, get it down to bare metal so we can get welding. And as you can see, the flap wheel makes really short work of that. It does a really nice job. Right down to the bare metal, and that is great for us to get started welding on. I'm just gonna finish off the rest of that, and we should be good to go after that. I needed to strengthen this up a little bit, and I had a bunch of suggestions from people on how I was going to do it, but looking at how it was installed from factory, immediately I know exactly what I'm going to do to strengthen it. I'm not going to add extra material. In my personal opinion, I think that the steel that is in there, the thickness, I don't think my diff is ever going to break it. I don't think there's no way that that bolt is going to pull through and rip that steel apart. When it failed at the weld. So looking at the weld right after it came apart, it was a very nicely done weld. Looked like it was a machine that did it, but it didn't have a ton of penetration. It seemed like it looked like it was a nicely finished, very, very tidy weld, but it didn't look like it had a ton of heat in there to really penetrate and really stick that together well. I think that was the problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to weld it the same way, put that guy back on. I'm going to weld here on the outside. And also what I'm going to do is weld on the inside as well. And then of course with flux core wire, you do have the shielding. It's kind of like welding with a stick, where you've got shielding over top of any bead that you lay down. So you just want to chip that off, or in my case, I'm just going to wire wheel that off. So when I do my final pass over top, none of that contamination gets in the weld. It's just going to be clean. Trying to keep this as clean and as strong as I possibly can. Okay, so we got some good tacks on there. Is a good start. And the one thing that we want to make sure of is that we're getting some penetration. We want to make sure that not only are we melting the material in, but we've got enough heat in there that it's doing it not just on a surface level, but deeply. And one good thing is, if we look inside here, we can already see on those tacks we're getting marks there, we're getting penetration, which is great. burned a little. Not gonna lie. Oh. Looking pretty good, looking pretty good. Looking pretty good, man. Looking pretty good. Honestly, this weld is turning out great. Like, I've got a lot of penetration. It's decently smooth. Like, the fact that I'm going uphand, you know, like I'm welding over top of what I'm doing, it actually is turning out pretty good. We're getting lots of penetration. The welder's doing pretty good. I'm pretty stoked here. Should be lots of strength. Pretty good job for not even being able to get in there. Yeah, lots of heat, lots of penetration. Let's check our penetration over top here and just see what we're dealing with. Oh yeah, we're getting lots of penetration there. That's great. That means we got a very strong weld happening. Now trying to get the inside of this is going to be a little bit more difficult, but see what we can do. I had to make a couple passes on the inside and then clean it up with a flap wheel and a grinding stone, some of the excess weld that was in there, but we did get it and we got both sides, the outside and the inside good. So this weld should be amazingly solid. Shouldn't have any problems snapping this in the future. It should be good for the life of the car. So now that I've got that sanded, we're pretty much ready to apply some paint because we don't want that to rust once we do have it back in the car. We want to protect that as much as we can, so we're going to add some paint. Now before we add some paint, we've got it sanded so that we know that the paint is going to adhere to the surface that we're going to spray it on. But first things first, we got to prep a little bit. This is grease and wax remover. This is a Duplicolor project. So this one is pre-paint prep. Basically, we're going to put that on there. It's going to get rid of any kind of grease, anything that the paint is not going to stick to. This is kind of our last step before painting, just to make sure that the chassis paint that we apply to this is going to stick and stay forever, because I don't ever want to have to worry about rust on my cradle. And just kind of wipe down the areas. And this stuff smells pretty strong, so it is a very good idea to air the area out if you're going to be using for any kind of a long, prolonged period of a time. It would be a super smart idea. It'd be a super smart idea to have an exhaust fan going, or crack a door, anything like that. But I'm just going to use this on a couple areas and then air the garage out. That's all I really need. Okay, so now that we've got that covered, the paint that I'm going to use on this is this stuff. It is VHT roll bar and chassis high temperature self-priming chassis paint. So the nice thing about this is you don't have to use a primer. This stuff self-primes. It is designed for it and specifically designed for chassis and roll bars and things that are a little bit tougher surfaces, things that get beat up a little more. So I figured we'd give this a shot. I think this should probably do exactly what we want it to do. Same black sort of color that we need. And this should protect all the bare steel that we just had to strip for welding. We should be able to apply this, throw a couple coats on, should be able to slap it back in good as new.